And so I was sent home early from that deployment and kind of felt like I was forced into this treatment that didn't necessarily seem to fit. And that was, kind of a major turning point for me of, I'm going to have to figure out how to handle things better and learn how to advocate for myself better moving forward. And I also realized, at that point that women in the military, and at least in my experience, we tended to be pit against each other a lot. So all the other women that were in my unit were kind of seen in some way as like this threat. And I realized that it was kind of bullshit that, the men could just kind of do whatever they wanted. But the second there was new women around, it was somehow she was my competition, or she needed to be some sort of a threat. And like, I think flipping that script really changed my perspective on what it means to be a leader and what it means to be someone who is serving.
Welcome to Your Story Doesn't End Here, the mental health podcast of military and veterans who refuse to be silenced. I'm your host, Rachel, and my mission with this podcast is to be a voice for those who don't have a voice, bring awareness to mental health issues, provide value and solutions, and to change the culture when it comes to mental health within the DoD organizations. Hey, everyone, and thank you so much for coming back for another episode of Your Story Doesn't End Here. Today, we have Lieutenant Rachael, a clinical psychology intern in the U.S. Navy. Rachael enlisted in the Navy in 2009. She served 14 years as an intelligence specialist and completed 4 deployments before transitioning to a medical service corps officer in clinical psychology in the summer of 2023. Rachael is completing her doctorate in clinical psychology in the spring of 2024, and her dissertation work focuses on the effect of command/unit support on career and mental health outcomes in women who have experienced military sexual trauma. Rachael, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, so I'm just going to pass it off to you to share your story. I'm so excited to hear it, and especially from someone that is doing the work themselves and then also having served. So passing it off to you.
Yeah. I grew up in Florida, and when I graduated high school, I just really didn't know exactly what it was that I wanted to do with the rest of my life. So I started going to college and realized that I wasn't really in a place where I knew I could focus on anything, and kind of just spent 4 years finishing classes here and there, and ultimately realized I wanted to do something with my life. And I had an aunt that had served in the Navy, and was an intel officer. So I thought maybe that would be a way that I could give back to the community and do something that, had a little bit of more meaning than working part-time jobs here and there. And so that's what I did. And it was the best decision that I ever made. So I came in 2009, and I went through ISA school and C school for expeditionary intelligence. And then I ultimately did 4 deployments with some intel units and NSW units. And during that time, I went all around the world. I had some really awesome experiences, some really not awesome experiences. And I saw a lot of, women, girls my own age who were dealing with some really heavy stuff. I think the culture in the Navy is, and, still is, but even more so than, there's a lot of, drinking and a lot of emphasis on, especially in the lower enlisted ranks, people are still trying to figure out who they are. And so people end up in situations that aren't necessarily great. And
ultimately,
my story, contains a lot of pieces that led me into the mental health, led me back to really so wanting to study mental health. So I would say, on my first deployment, I ended up going through a tough breakup, and I was feeling pretty low in that time. And I reached out to a senior chief that I had at that time. And unfortunately, the way that my words were taken were kind of twisted in a way. And, I felt that they really misrepresented me, but I was still an E4 at the time. And I'd been in the Navy less than 2 years. And so I didn't really know how to advocate for myself And so I was sent home early from that deployment, and kind of was forced into this, kind of felt like I was forced into this treatment that didn't necessarily seem to fit. And that was, kind of a major turning point for me of, I'm going to have to figure out how to handle things better and learn how to advocate for myself better moving forward. And I also realized, at that point, that women in the military, and especially, at least in my experience, we tended to be pit against each other a lot. So all the other women that were in my unit were kind of seen in some way as like this threat. And I don't really think that that was something that I recognized until maybe later on, once I was E5 or more, like in the E6, and had been in the Navy a little bit while longer. And I realized that it was kind of bullshit that, the men could just kind of do whatever they wanted. But the second there was new women around, it was somehow she was my competition, or she needed to be some sort of a threat. And like, I think flipping that script really changed my perspective on what it means to be a leader and what it means to be someone who is serving. So somewhere around 2015, 2016, I realized if I was going to do a lot more in the military, I was going to have to finish my degree. So I went back to school while I was in active duty, finished my undergraduate in psychology through UMUC at the time. Most of the time I was either forward deployed or at training, and I was going to school full time. It was a little bit stressful, but I knew that it was something that I really wanted. And when I set my mind to something, I tend to kind of doggedly pursue it. And once I finished my undergraduate degree, it was just this moment of what's next. I had always thought I was going to stay in the Navy for 20 years. I was going to retire. I had plans of being an intel officer and kind of following in my aunt's footsteps. And once I finished my degree, I realized that that wasn't necessarily the path that I wanted to take. So again, maybe on a complete whim, I started looking into grad school. I had a year left in the Navy, and I went and applied for graduate programs, and somehow I got into a doctoral program, and I decided that I was going to transition into the reserves to pursue my doctorate in psychology. That was a really interesting time. I had no idea what I was getting into. I don't know that anyone really does necessarily, but it was a lot harder than I thought it was going to be. And I think just sometimes I make the joke that most of the stuff that I've done in the Navy so far, I've done out of spite. So I think I can think back to before I even got into A school, people asked, well, what C school do you want to go to? And I said, oh, I want to go 3912, which is ground. And they made fun of me because, oh, girls don't do that. And I was like, that's stupid. Yeah, like, fuck you, watch me. And then I remember like a few other times in my career, like kind of voicing the things that I wanted to do, and people really like talking down to me or treating me like I wasn't going to be good enough or I couldn't do it. And I internalized a lot of that. And so this was kind of this piece of, I'm still going to do it. One thing that I recognized about halfway through grad school is that spike can get you really, really far, but it can't necessarily take you the whole way. And so there has to be some other motivating factor. I started grad school in the summer of 2018. I had just gotten back from a mission where I was in Germany for a few weeks, and I came back from that mission. I had about 10 days left in the Navy, and then I was out. So I started grad school, and I knew that I wanted my focus to be the military. And once I had made the decision to go to grad school, I decided, well, I'm going to finish this. I'm going to bet on myself, and I'm going to come back into the Navy, and I'm going to be a military psychologist. And that was my ultimate goal all along. So that's what I set out to do. It was my third year in my program. COVID was in full swing, and I went through this series of absolutely just kind of unfortunate events, I guess. Like, I had COVID. I started having bad back problems, which wasn't the first time. I had back surgery in November of 2017 while I was still on active duty. But I also went through a few other surgeries back to back, and that was an incredibly mentally draining time in my life. And then went through a pretty traumatic breakup. And it was this time of flipping the switch and just completely upending everything that I thought was maybe true. And what it did was really, it firmed up my resolve to continue to pursue this path that I wanted in clinical psychology, and I wanted in the Navy. And I was really afraid that they were going to tell me I couldn't come back in because of, I'd been going to counseling to deal with some issues relating to grief and from the end of a relationship and some other things. And then I had a history of, some physical injuries. And so I was pretty concerned, even though I was great on the reserve side, they might not want me back on active duty. But despite that, I kind of kept it in the back of my mind and, continued to move forward. So when it came time to decide, what my dissertation, what my focus was going to be, I knew it was going to be in the military. I knew I wanted it to be about military sexual trauma. And it's kind of this complicated and vague idea. Military sexual trauma in and of itself is this really large construct. And it's been studied in so many different ways. And there's so much research out there. And yet at the same time, a lot of that research really doesn't seem to cover what it really is and what the impact actually is. So we know that there's a ton of financial impact to the military. We know that there's a lot of physical health symptoms that are associated with sexual assault and sexual harassment. We know there's a lot of mental health impact. We know that there's a lot of just impact to what it means to have an identity as a woman or a female identifying person in the military when it comes to sexual trauma. So I had to kind of find maybe something a little bit more specific. And that took me a long time to identify what that was really going to be. And I settled on this idea of, because it had been something that I had noticed throughout my career, there's not a whole lot of women in senior positions. And the ones that are tend to be labeled in ways that, are labeled really negatively, kind of calling back to that earlier idea of, we tend to be pitted against each other as women in the military. So I thought about the female mentors that I had throughout my career, and I realized I didn't have a whole lot. And I was thinking, why does that happen? And what are some of the reasons that women tend to get out? Women hemorrhage out of the military at about that mid-career mark, way more than their male peers. And it was something that I wanted to explore a little bit more of why that was. There's a lot of reasons for it, but I hypothesized that, likely the extent of sexual harassment and sexual assault could, maybe be a reason that women choose not to continue on in their careers. And what are the effect of that, of women wanting to leave, what that really means on the military force as a whole. So that's the angle that I decided to go in my dissertation research. And it really shaped a lot of, it happened to, I think that finalization of what my topic was going to be right around the time that the Vanessa Julian case was coming up. There was a lot of just different social issues that were occurring, kind of culminating, and it really kind of cemented this is the way I need to go, because women need to have a voice. And so there was it was kind of the military's Me Too movement kind of happening all in that time between 2020 and 2021 when I was finalizing this research topic. So that's what I did. And the next 2 years, I continued to work towards my degree. And then I was also still serving in the reserves. And then in the summer of 2022, I was already making plans to apply for internship. So the last year of your doctoral program in psychology is a year-long internship. And you start the process way out. I started talking to the military recruiters, hoping to pursue that. And in July of 2022, I found out that I had been selected for chief, which was awesome. And also horrible timing because I was, getting ready for one of the busiest times of my graduate career. And also, probably one of the busiest times that you can possibly have in the military as well. And I don't really know how I did it exactly because I was waking up at 3 a.m. and going to bed at 11 p.m. for, I think, maybe 3 months straight. But it really taught me a lot about myself and how I needed to prioritize things, and showed me exactly what it was that what work-life balance actually meant. One of the command master chiefs, one of his like big sayings that he always said was that work-life balance is that when everyone in your life is a little bit mad at you, that's when you probably have some balance. So my recruiter was angry at me because I wasn't doing the things he needed me to do to get my paperwork in on time. The reserves, the chiefs were mad at me because I wasn't able to attend all the trainings I needed to. My dissertation chair was mad at me because I wasn't continuing to move forward on my dissertation the way I needed to. So, everyone was a little bit frustrated with my performance. And I knew I was not operating at 100%. I also knew that it wasn't something that I was going to have to continue to do. So I just kind of gutted it out. And it was really, a really great experience in so much that I figured out how to say no and really learned how to do that and not feel guilty about it for maybe the first time in my life because I had no other choice. So then I went through the internship interview season, and I knew all I really wanted was the Navy. But I ran into multiple roadblocks. And so I think one of the coolest things that happened is really one of the things that helped me finally get my commission. So I applied, I went through MEPS again, which is something I was really hoping I was never going to have to do after having gone through it in 2008. And they said I was not qualified to be in the military. And I was like, that's interesting because I'm considered fit for full duty in the reserves. And they were like, thanks for playing. Have a nice life. There's no waivers that are available for you. And so that was a pretty interesting. I had about 24 hours where I just lost my shit and just freaked out. I called a few of my friends, and I started to think, well, I guess I can just work for the VA and that'll be fine, and I can be happy there. And then I realized that I had to keep fighting, and so that's what I did. And called my recruiter the next day, and I said, hey, what are the next steps? And he's like, listen, Rachel, I'm sorry. They said no, there's nothing else. You can't get a waiver. And I said, I know, I hear you. Who else can I talk to? And I called the national training director for Navy psychology, and I told him what was going on. And so we started working it. So there was a Navy cryptologic chief who died in Syria in 2019, Shannon Kent. And she is ultimately the person that I have to really thank for being able to get my commission. So she had applied to USIS to become a clinical psychologist and was, working in special operations. She was just like a complete badass, but she had had a thyroid cancer at some point in her career. And so USIS wanted her and they had accepted her, but Big Navy came back and said, no, you're not qualified to be an officer. And she was like, this is crap. And she lobbied at Congress and she did all sorts of amazing things. And ultimately the regulation was changed to say that, if you are considered fit for full duty, that the Navy should not be able to, the regulation should not be able to prevent you from bettering your career, essentially. And so that regulation was changed. Unfortunately, it was changed after she had deployed and died in Syria. But I worked in similar communities to her in a lot of my career. And so a lot of my good friends were close to her. And one of my friends had been when she had made chief a few years before I did, Shannon gave her anchors. So when I was pinned to chief, my friend pinned me with Shannon's anchors and told me that I had to keep fighting and I needed to, like have Shannon's anchors because I was going to be able to carry on the dream that she had had. And that was one of the things that kind of kept me going through that fight with the Navy. So it was this really big full circle moment of I had to essentially use that same regulation to fight and be able to get my commission. And I went to ODS in July, and now I am completing my final year of clinical psychology training with the Navy and working on finishing my dissertation that is talking about these impacts that the units and the commands that women are associated with, how they can impact whether or not we want to stay in after we might experience things that are related to sexual harassment and assault. So that's, I think, probably the main themes.
Well, your story is incredibly inspiring, and I truly hope you write a book someday, honestly, because that just hearing even the last part of your story where you talk about persevering, most people wouldn't do that. Most people would go to MEPS. Oh, you're not qualified. Okay, I'll just move on to the next thing. And I'm always so inspired by women, especially who say, no, I'm not taking no for an answer. But then the reason behind it too is just that's so special. It's almost like it was paved, like the way was paved for you to take this opportunity, which you did. And so I'm incredibly inspired by that. Can you talk us through once, obviously you went to the recruiter says, no, I can't help you. And then you knew this information, but how did you use that information to work in your advantage to get to the point where they would give you a commission?
Yeah. So I spoke with my friend she's currently an intel officer, and she's also, her story is pretty amazing in and of itself on the way that she's also had to fight with the Navy to keep, to keep her career. But I talked to her and she's like, she was like, all right, she's like, are you willing to fight? Are you ready? And I was just like, I don't know. I don't think that I have it in me. But I just decided like I have anything to lose at that point. This is my dream. So I either was going to choose to pursue it or I was going to find a new path. Either way, I figured out I'm going to be a doctor. I'll probably be okay. But I knew that this is what I've always wanted. So I went to the medical regulations. I looked up, I explained to the recruiter that I knew that there was a way forward and that we were just going to have to figure it out. We were going to have to find it. And then the other piece of it is that I went to the training director, and when I did that, he was like, this is what happened a few years ago with Chief Kent, and it's really unfortunate that they do that. So we're going to see what we can do. And so they made the phone calls and they said, okay, if you can provide us with XYZ evidence. And so it was like a whirlwind of just medical appointment after medical appointment after medical appointment. And, trying to like find evidence from my career dating back to 2011 to say that I am, not mentally unstable, and I'm currently not symptomatic when it comes to back symptoms, and I am fit for full duty. So like once all of that was kind of in line, they sent it up. I think it had to go to an admiral somewhere at BUMED, and it finally came back and I got a positive disposition for that. But it would have been a completely different outcome if I had not chosen to, pretty much call everyone I knew and use every favor that I, could possibly cash in.
Yeah, it's such an interesting conversation, which we could probably spend the next few hours talking about, because, when you think about fit for full on one side, which you were considered fit for full, to me, it brings up the thought in my head of, how many times in the military do people in certain positions make sure someone is fit for full just because they need to check the box and keep a certain retention number, right? When, maybe there are certain people, well, I know there's certain people in the military that should not actually be fit for full, but someone is checking that box to make sure they are, right? And then on the MEP side of things, it's like, well, maybe they're being more picky on MEPs about who they're letting in the military, but there's a disconnect there somewhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, I'm sure that the process is designed to be as objective as possible. But the reality is that whatever provider is sitting in that chair on that day is going to have to make some sort of a subjective opinion. And that's why there's a waiver process that is associated with all of these decisions. But someone is going to make that final determination, and that person is human. And, they're not always going to get it right. It's something I'm facing as a provider now in the military. Is I'm going to be making these same decisions for people who are facing med boards, for people who are facing those performance review boards, and I'm not going to get it right all the time either. So it's kind of coming back to that piece of one of the things that I had learned so early on in my career was, if I wasn't going to advocate for myself, then no one else was going to do that for me.
Yeah, and so the thing that I want to go back to in your story is the part where you talked about your experience where you were actually sent back home from, I believe you said it was a deployment, because of just a rough period in your life dealing with a breakup. Can you give us more details about that story? Like, what exactly happened and why? Because obviously not everyone that goes through a breakup is sent home. So what was it about your story that placed you in the position where you felt that they kind of went quote unquote above and beyond for something that you didn't feel was the right fit for you?
Yeah, it's kind of funny. I was actually talking to somebody about this today, but I had told my senior chief I was feeling really overwhelmed, and I was on board a ship that I was a shipwriter, and I'd maybe been on board 3 weeks or so, and so I didn't really know anyone, and I felt really isolated and just really overwhelmed, and I wasn't sleeping, and I reached out trying to get some semblance of support, or just talk to people that I knew. And I was just, never once was I like, oh, I'm going to kill myself, or I feel like I want to die, or anything like that. And I don't even remember now what exact words that I used, but nothing of it was anything that was like specific. But they were just like, well, we're going to bring you back. And that was that. And was it the best thing for me? I don't know. There's no way for me to know that. I mean, ultimately, what life is a series of responding to whatever the events that are outside of your control, and taking ownership and using the things that are in your control to continue to move forward. And I think that's what I had to do. It's really not a super exciting story, so there's not a whole lot more to it. But
Well, I think it's relatable though, and it's something I've talked about on the podcast before, is this kind of fine line area when it comes to leadership and mental health and culture, and there's so much more. It's not one of those simple black and white, like, oh well, people just need to respond in this way, because everyone's situation is different, and maybe someone is out there super overwhelmed, and maybe that is what they need, is to go back home because they just need a baseline break just to decompress. It's to where I typically tell people that's where getting to know your people is where it really helps in these specific situations. But then also asking questions, which can be very uncomfortable for people, especially when it comes to someone who's new, overwhelmed, and I think the female dynamic, I'm just going to say this, adds another layer to it for a lot of leadership, especially back then. Maybe not so much now, or maybe it is that way now. I'm not currently serving, but I think that when females specifically feel overwhelmed or bring up something to maybe a male leader, or sometimes even other female leaders, it adds another layer of discomfort, because a lot of leaders out there are still honestly just walking on eggshells with females in the military.
Yeah, and it's funny because earlier in that same deployment, one of my teammates had drunkenly, but had made a comment about, I want to kill myself because this X, Y, and Z is happening. And they brought him back to where we were deployed to, kept him there for a couple of weeks, and then sent him back out. But for me, the outcome was very different because I got sent all the way back home. And ultimately, like I think that could have impacted me maybe more. Fortunately, it didn't. And I kept moving forward. But those are decisions that, I think as a leader, I don't know how I would have necessarily handled that if I had been that senior chief in that position. I'd like to think maybe I would have handled it differently, but I'll never know. Um, so I think as a leader, you are faced with a lot of decisions. And like you said, knowing your people, asking, being more, I think, taking that intrusive leadership role and asking the really difficult questions and not being afraid to really engage and to connect and sometimes take your bias, like your biases about a person away as you're making some of those decisions as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm curious if that experience that you went through had any shaping or any part in your decision to move towards being in the mental health sector of the military, like you are now, like so involved now to help other people.
Probably only indirectly, honestly. I was still pretty young and I was angry at that point. Like that's really the only real emotion that I had from that was, well, I'm gonna like I'll show them kind of a deal. And spite again can get you pretty far. Um, Not gonna get you probably the whole way. But I mean I use that anger to propel me forward and that I mean, that worked for that period of time. I don't think it was really what brought me back to mental health, but I was working in NSW for 5 years. And as much as I love being in Intel, sometimes the day to day around the office was kind of mind numbing for me. And I really just liked talking to people. And so I would just, chat with people. And sometimes you get into like really deep conversations with people in my division, the people who were in my troop while we were deployed, and just like seeing the impact of deployments on people, seeing how so many people were just white knuckling their way through their career because they were afraid to reach out and ask for help, which I got, right? Like, because the one time I had reached out and asked for help, I felt like I got punished. And a lot of people feel that way. So I think just like understanding that that stigma is so real and there are reasons that that stigma exists in many ways. So that juxtaposition, I think, is ultimately what kind of led me back to the path of pursuing psychology and, wanting to be a mental health provider.
What did you learn throughout the process of doing all your research and studying for your dissertation?
I don't know.
That's a loaded
What
question.
didn't I learn? I tell people a lot, like there's like an inherently almost, it's not exactly selfish, but maybe selfish is a way of like understanding it. There's kind of a selfish piece of studying psychology because the more you do it, if you are in that process and you are doing the research and you are like learning the different theories, you're going to find some messed up stuff about yourself and you're faced with a decision. Am I going to go in there to like that ugly place of me? Am I going to root that out? I'm going to figure out what the fuck it is. Or am I just going to, put on this like happy smiley face and just like move forward? And you can do that like either way as a provider. I've seen people, kind of take that surface route. And I've also seen the people who kind of like me just maybe got to a point where they had no choice but to confront some of the ugly stuff and to work through and chose to work through it. But you have so much time and you are learning about all of these. Sometimes it happens by accident. Sometimes it comes up as a result of, being in the room with someone and hearing their story and realizing like, oh, that is a trigger for me. Why is that a trigger for me? That's weird. And then you're like, well, I guess I'm going to have to figure that out because I can't have that reaction every day for, the rest of the time that I'm doing this job. So there's a little bit of that. And then just, in the process of like hearing everyone's stories and just learning about different parts of psychology, you're always going to come up with something that resonates with you. And so you get to make the choice of how you're going to handle that and how you're going to move forward. I chose the hard route, I chose to make it really hard for myself and to just like not get lost in it, but to really do a whole lot of work to figure out how I could apply all of that in my own life and how I was going to be able to understand the pieces of me so I could show up in the room with other people and not do harm and truly be present and be a better provider.
A lot of what you said resonates with me so much. And I think that you had this unique time period when you were working on your dissertation where, you said that the military's Me Too movement was happening. And I don't know if you were a part of a lot of those Facebook groups where women were like taking that as an opportunity to feel the freedom to come out and share their stories. Unfortunately, a lot of them got shut down because of people who felt like it was their responsibility to report, which, it was weird mandatory reporting, fine line. But yeah, I'm curious if you were part of those Facebook groups, like did that have any impact on your research at all? Did you get stories from that or any perspective from that time period, the military Me Too movement?
Honestly, it was kind of overwhelming because I was really stressed out from my studies and, it obviously brings up it brought up a lot of stuff for me. And so kind of being involved in some of those groups, it ended up feeling pretty overwhelming at the time. And I took a few steps back, but it's still, reading so many people's stories and hearing so many of those same themes. And like the recurrent one was just like, I didn't, women just not knowing where to turn to, being afraid to report, feeling like once they did that they were punished or that they got kicked out of, or whatever the case might be. And that was just something that was just such an undercurrent in every single story. And like I said, it really was the thing that kind of brought me to the specific area of MST that I wanted to research.
So then as a provider in the military, will you be working in a specific demographic or is it just an overarching, you work with anyone who's serving?
There's a kind of a running joke in psychology, which is just it depends. As military psychologists, you are going to be a general practitioner, but I think one of the really important things to remember about psychology is that every person has trauma of some sort, and be that like the big traumas or of near-death experiences or rape or the death of a loved one or physical assault or whatever those big T traumas are, or like a series of micro traumas that might have occurred that are like leading to some of those same symptoms of like that post-traumatic stress symptoms and whatever they look like. Everyone's got trauma in some way, shape, or form. No one gets out of life unscathed by it. So trauma is kind of it's everyone's deal. And so I'm always going to be working with people who have that. And if you're being a military provider, it's such a MST is part of unfortunately a lot of people's stories. So it doesn't matter where I go, it's still going to be a theme that I'm going to be working with.
And I'm glad you said that trauma piece because I think often a lot of people feel like trauma has to be something quote unquote significant, like a car accident or, for some people, a really big breakup or a death that, directly impacted them. And you're so right when you say that trauma really is subjective to the person. But everyone experiences it. And it's so important to recognize that. That for some people, trauma might be something that for someone else maybe isn't considered traumatic, but it doesn't mean that it's any less traumatic for the person that is experiencing it and feeling that. And so I'm so glad that you have that perspective, especially going into the military as a provider, because that's an important mindset to have, I really feel. Is there anything that you feel that you will be bringing or would like to bring to the military mental health space that will either positively contribute to the culture that the military, should be working towards, in your opinion, or anything that you think that you bring to the table that's really just going to help make military mental health better, for lack of a better phrase?
So I do want to address that question, and if you can ask that again, but I want to go back and I want to actually respond to what you said before that, which is that the literature supports everything that you said, that the physiological and cognitive impact of perceived trauma, even though like maybe even objectively for some person, that trauma might not be like so significant, but as compared to someone who's living in a war-torn country and is like facing death all the time. But the physiological and the psychological impact that that trauma has on one person is the same, as regardless of the like objective severity of the trauma itself. That person's perception of it, whatever that thing is that is traumatic to them, it has the same psychological effect as something that is maybe like one of the worst objective types of trauma that you can incur as a human being. So it's really about like, what is your experience and how is it that you're perceiving that trauma? And that's the thing that's kind of that like the crux and the heart of the matter.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I read a book. The name of it is not popping up in my mind right now. Viktor Frankl, I believe, is the author, and he was actually in concentration camps back in the day when Nazi Germany was a thing, and there were concentration camps. And I admittedly haven't finished reading the entire book yet, but the whole idea behind the book is that like his experience was vastly different than majority of the experiences we hear about. And like, this man was in a concentration camp. Like, naturally we would think, oh, went through a lot of trauma and experienced the worst thing in the world. But like, that truly shows that it really is about perspective, and everyone's perspective is different, which is why some people join the military and it's the worst thing in the world, and other people join the military and it's the best thing in the world. And it's not that, oh, well, you just had a bad experience, or, oh, you just didn't look at this the right way. No, it's just how I perceive my experience in the military, or how someone else did. So, yeah.
Yeah. And you're also touching on another huge and important aspect. One of the things that, I think for me, that I want to be able to emphasize as I like work with people, which is the idea of that post-traumatic growth, right? And so the difference for a lot of people between, post-traumatic stress symptoms and ultimately like maybe reaching a clinical level of post-traumatic stress disorder, and also people who can seemingly just like move throughout from trauma to trauma and kind of escape without some of those really negative impacts. It goes to a couple of things, which is like resilience, which is kind of kind of this weird buzzword that has this vague amalgamous meaning, and also post-traumatic growth, which is that mindset of taking the thing that has happened and using it to move you forward and to appreciate pieces of life in a different way, accepting that it happened and it might have been the crappiest thing in the world, and yet there are also things that can come from that are good and positive.
And you may have answered that question that I asked initially in your answer just now about bringing that post-traumatic growth piece to the military. Is there anything else that you feel that you will be bringing to the military that will contribute to that positive, or maybe not positive is the word, but contribute to what I think collectively the military should be moving towards, to just promote a better mental health culture?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think everyone who comes into the field has a desire to do good and wants to help. I truly think that like anyone who's joining the military to be any kind of mental health professional at any level is doing that with good intentions and with a desire to help. For me, I think the more I looked at rape and sexual assault and things like that, the more I came to this conclusion, like one, we're never going to stop it. It's always going to happen. So what else? What else can we actually tackle to like help with some of these outcomes? And so that's really getting at how do we instill a sense of resiliency? How do we work towards increasing someone's ability to cope with instances of trauma, be they combat trauma, sexual trauma, just general life trauma, whatever that is, or just circumstances. How do you build that person up so that as they are facing that one, they're able to reach out and cultivate a support network, but also that they have those internal coping resources that they're going to better be able to withstand some of the inevitably difficult and challenging times that a person has throughout their military career. It's really easy for me to be like, well, I've been a junior enlisted person and I spent so much time in the military, and like most people come in and they don't do that. And that'd be a really easy thing for me to say. But as a mental health provider, I've not been through 99% of what the people that I am talking with daily, the things that they have dealt with. And the reality is you don't have to be able to truly be there and to support another person. That being said, I do think that there is a different perspective and a different way. I'm more fluent in the language of I'm more fluent in speaking Navy, and I have a more like basic understanding of some of those things. And some of that is a little bit intangible in the room, but I think it kind of does help to, and I'm hoping it will help to allow me to cultivate that alliance with whatever client that comes in to the room, so that we can build a working relationship and tackle whatever issues that they're coming in with and bringing them to a more positive outcome.
And I'm curious just what your personal opinions and feelings are about members of the military who choose to use mental health in more of a preventative perspective rather than, I think the mental health in the military is often seen as a reactive thing. And I think a lot of service members truly use it as reactive. I know I did when I served, and I know quite a few people who we wait till it gets really bad, just like anything. And I can't even say this is just mental health, because a lot of members of the military, just because of the way that the culture is, will wait until it is really bad and then we'll go in and get help. Do you think that the military has the capacity to support service members on a preventative standpoint? This is just your personal opinion. And then B, what are your thoughts surrounding that?
Yeah, obviously, whatever I say is definitely not representative of like the Navy stance on anything. I don't know that we really have the capacity right now to address everyone's issues in a preventative way. Certainly not at an individual level. I don't think the civilian sector, that being said, has the ability to do that. And we saw that with COVID. The waiting periods for like mental health services just grew exponentially. I can remember being in a practicum at the VA, and individuals who were coming in, veterans, were waiting 1 to 2 months to even get an intake appointment at some of the clinics. And it's, there are just not enough mental health providers that were really available to meet the need that continued to grow. So I think we're seeing there's like an intersection of a bunch of different social and psychosocial shifts right now. One, more broadly in society, and then the military as a reflection of that. There is a change for how we're perceiving mental health. And so there is more of a willingness to go out and ask for and seek out mental health. Now, if you're being met with, we can't do that, you're going to likely reduce an individual's willingness or desire to continue to do that, to ask for help again in the future. But I think more broadly, we are seeing a shift of a reduced stigma of seeking out mental health help. And so that brings in a need for additional capacity for psychologists and social workers and counselors. And so the field itself is going to have to continue to rise to meet that need to have qualified, competent providers who are available to provide that care for individuals. The military, the Navy specifically, I know has grown. I want to say they said from like 150 to this could be totally wrong, so I should know the answer to this, but like I want to say they've grown like over 75 bills for clinical psychologists in maybe like the last 10 years or so. I would anticipate that number is likely going to continue to increase, but there's a lot of other variables that are going to impact where we allocate funding within the Navy and the DoD as an overall enterprise. So I don't really know what that's going to look like. So do we have that capacity? I don't know. I would want to be optimistic. I think that we are working, there's the Navy coaching initiative that's taken off. That is, I think, really that coaching piece is a little bit more of the finding goals and partnering with someone to kind of reach some of those goals, which that is a really helpful area that can also kind of address that can just give a person an outlet to talk through the things that they're dealing with that might be like getting in the way. And so more of that, like going from that neutral stance to more of that positive stance instead of that more reactive level of, all right, someone's sick and how do we get them to a place of like being okay, or moving in the direction of good. So kind of someone already being in like a neutral or like good place and then moving them forward. So those are kind of two different ends of the spectrum. So I think that the Navy coaching is probably a really good initiative that can help meet the need for that, like almost in some ways of that preventative. But I think there's a lot more work to be done. And I think some continued peer programs, peer development, peer groups, those can also help to meet some of these needs as well, while we work to augment the capacity of providing that clinical care.
Yeah, I would agree with you. And I'm glad you brought up the coaching piece, because yes, that's an incredibly important aspect. And I haven't been able to really follow along with how successful that has been. I hope it is successful, because I am a huge proponent of coaching, and also understanding too that prevention of mental health crisis can look like several different things too. So knowing that there's MWR programs, there's nonprofits, that you brought up the peer thing. There are several nonprofits that, yes, a lot of active duty think that nonprofits in the veteran space are just for veterans. A lot of them also serve active duty too. So that's another important conversation that I just wanted to highlight, is that there are peer support groups out there, even outside of the DoD, that support military. It's just obviously finding them and accessing those resources. So
yeah. And I think highlighting so Fleet and Family Services offers a lot of programs, and some of those are also will help people get connected to mental health counseling. I know the website Give an Hour, they offer free services to military service members. There are a lot of local nonprofits. One that I am pretty familiar with from the Hampton Roads area is Trails of Purpose. And so that is led by someone I know, a mental health counselor, Kayla Arestivo, and her crew, and they do a lot of free work with equine therapy, group therapy, and they offer services to military service members and veterans. There's lots of nonprofits out there like that. It does take digging sometimes, unfortunately, but those resources are there. And I think one of the pieces for someone who might actively be struggling is it might feel really overwhelming for you to do the work to do that digging. It may be really beneficial to just ask somebody that can you help me find somebody? And let someone who might have a little bit more capacity do some of that digging to help connect you to someone who can partner with you in getting care for the issues that are ongoing in your life.
Because we're talking about the digging piece, there are some nonprofits. I don't know about one in Virginia, but Veteran Help Point, I believe she's based out of Florida. I may or may not be wrong. Or like the San Diego Veterans Coalition on the West Coast. They are nonprofits that are set up to be that coalition of resources, and they are pre-vetted. So if I ever find one that is up in Virginia, I would hope there's one in Virginia, because it is such a huge military area. I think that's kind of in the works. If there's not already one, there may be. If you're listening to this episode and you know of a coalition of resources up in that area, please let me know so that we can share that information with people who are listening. And don't have the capacity to pre-vet a bunch of resources. But I love, Rachel, that you brought up the point of just asking, because it's such a simple thing to do that makes a lot of people uncomfortable, because it requires that vulnerability of, now I have to let someone know that maybe I'm struggling with something, whether that be mental health or financial or just like basic human needs. Reaching out and asking for help, there's no shame in it, but a lot of times that's what holds us back from getting what we need. So really important.
Yeah, I do want to maybe reframe a little bit. Like sometimes things that are simple when we are struggling, that just because it's simple doesn't mean it's not really hard. So reaching out and asking for help, it can be really, really difficult. And so going back to the idea of that intrusive leadership piece, or just as a friend, kind of like if someone's dealing with something, or their like general demeanor has shifted, asking those tough questions, and offering, hey, can I help you find somebody? Like, have you looked into, have you looked into this? Just as mental health professionals, sometimes we're the worst at taking our own advice, and I can tell you that I like we will sit there and like almost yell at each other, like, no, you need therapy, no, you need therapy, you need to go. We all reach those places in our lives where things maybe just aren't quite manageable. It doesn't matter if you are the strongest person in the world, you're going to hit a point where you're going to need somebody to talk to. So, and yeah, friends, family, support, all of that is wonderful. Sometimes you also just need that unbiased, just kind of that unconditional, like positive regard that, therapy is supposed to offer. And someone who is maybe trained to sit with you in a slightly different way.
Well, Rachel, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate your perspective. It's not often that I get to hear from people that are entering the military as a mental health provider, but also have that experience of their own to be able to share. So like I said earlier, your story is so powerful and unique and inspiring. Honestly, I really meant it when I said you should write a book someday, because I will 100% grab a copy, and I think it would impact so many other people too, just hearing your story. Last question, is there any last words or pieces of advice that you want to leave the listeners with today?
With the risk of kind of sounding like overly positive, I think one of the things that I have told so many mentees and junior sailors is, like, if there is something that you want to do in the military, make them tell you no, and then make them continue to tell you no. And if you really want it, be willing to fight for it, because there are so many paths to yes, and you're the only one who can decide whether or not you are willing to keep going and to get to that answer that you want.
Thank you for taking the time to listen in today. With your support, we are able to increase awareness of the mental health issues affecting service members and veterans today, with the goal of creating positive change. If you got value from this episode, please take 30 seconds to subscribe and share this episode within your own network. Until next time, remember, your story matters, your mental health matters, and your story doesn't end here.